I guess most musicians remember their first paying gig in the music business, and I surprised myself that I had never actually thought that much about my own first picking job till I heard someone else talking about theirs. It was an easy enough date to remember, I just never thought about it till now. It was New Year's Eve, 1962-63. I was almost 15 years old and had been playing my harmony acoustic guitar for about 6 months. That doesn't seem like very long until you realize that from the moment I bought the guitar, it had never left my hands except when I had to stop and eat or perform any other life-sustaining duties. I could already play in C, D, and G chords as long as it was a three-chord song, plus I could sing all the Stonewall Jackson, Porter Wagoner, and Hank Locklin tunes I heard on the Opry. My attraction to the Opry and traditional country music would in the next couple of years come to lower my cool factor with my high school peers by several points when those four shaggy-haired beatniks from England hit America like a Category 5 tornado through an Oklahoma trailer park. I believe my quote at the time was, "The Beatles are a passing fad. No one will remember them next year, so y'all need to start listening to Stonewall Jackson." In the 60s, that musical attitude did not get you elected class president in Antlers, Oklahoma, or anywhere else in America, if those of you who are old enough to remember will recall. I didn't care then, and come to think of it, I don't care much now either. Anyway, back to the gig. My dad, for some odd reason, was over at Barry Trotter's, the local bootlegger. I bet they were discussing the weather, when he learned that Barry was having a New Year's Eve party and needed some live music. A fiddle player had been located, but they needed a guitar player, so my dad volunteered me for the job. I didn't come from an Ozzie and Harriet background, so my dad getting me a playing gig at a bootlegger's New Year's Eve party when I was 14 years old didn't even raise an eyebrow of interest, but instead was considered a grand opportunity. On the night of the big gig, my dad drove me there and made arrangements for someone else to bring me home at the end of the night, and I embarked on the musical career/curse that would follow me the rest of my life in one form or another. I was introduced to the fiddle player, establishing the recurring theme of never meeting musicians until it was time to play. Another habit established that night was looking out over the crowd and thinking, what the heck am I doing here? I would grow accustomed to both of these little oddities in nightclubs and honky-tonks over the many years. I soon found out that if the fiddle player and I had one thing in common, it was not going to be anything to do with music. It was obvious to me that he didn't listen to our local country music radio station KIHN AM out of Hugo, Oklahoma. I got the feeling after a short conversation that he probably thought the Louvin brothers and Hank Williams Sr. were pop acts. I'll never forget that strange, sad look in the fiddle player's eye when I told him I had never heard of a schottish or a Virginia reel and asked him why the songs he played didn't have any words. We quickly decided our repertoire would include me singing one song by myself, and then he would play one fiddle tune by himself. We put this plan in action and started the dance. It soon became apparent that our audience was not music critics, and they were quite satisfied with anything we came up with. The night wore on, and it was obvious that not everyone got my dad's message that I was not to be drinking. The dancers would bring the fiddle player a shot of whiskey on a regular basis, and every once in a while they would sneak me a drink. After a few drinks, the fiddle player realized I could play along to his instrumentals if he called out the chords, so we were able to make twice as much noise on each of his songs. Even after all these years, I can't bring myself to call it music, although that New Year's Eve night, everyone thought it was just fine. I only remember one song I sang that night, which was an old Stonewall Jackson song. Well, it wasn't old then. I later learned he had written it with George Jones, and the title was Life to Go. The reason I remember it was because I never figured out for 30 years the little twist that the songwriters had snuck into it. The prisoner in the song had been in prison for 18 years, but yet he has a baby daughter. The irony becomes rather obvious once you realize, even if it takes 30 years, that prisoners did not have conjugal visits in the 60s, and that fact sneaks right past the prisoner in this song as he professes his love for his little baby girl. The fact that I overlooked that has tempered my anger at singers who, through the years, have changed the lyrics to my songs I have written and then recorded versions that made absolutely no sense thanks to their changes. Sometimes singers just don't get it, and unfortunately at one time that included me. At least I've tried to learn from my mistakes, and I'm almost obsessed now with getting the lyrics correct on any songs I produce. We didn't even make an attempt at Old Lang Syne that night, but the party just wound down and every one of the party goers stumbled out the door and headed home. Bootlegger said he would drive me home. Then he told us the people had passed the hat and we made $4, so we split that up, $2 each. I remember thinking I could buy a new set of black diamond guitar strings, which are 55 cents at Barry's drugstore in Antlers, and that would still leave me with a profit of $1.45 for the night. I wish I could say that was the least I ever made in my career for a night of picking and grinning, but I know there's probably too many musicians out there listening to this to try to slip that little white lie by them. When we pulled up to my front door and I was getting my guitar out of the bootlegger's truck, he slipped me a pint jar about half full of moonshine and a couple of RC colas left over from the party. He said, "You and your buddies can have your own little party tomorrow, but don't let anyone know I gave you this whiskey." As he drove off into the night, I stashed the contraband under our front porch and sat there on the front porch steps and tried to get a handle on this new life as a professional musician that had just been introduced to me. January 1st, 1963. I woke up much older and thinking I was much wiser. Looking back, I'm not sure I was either, but it was obvious that those days of youthful innocence were now behind me. Not really afraid, I rather welcomed what I perceived as maturity in my life, with what very well could have been nothing more than ignorance. I had to entertain my family over breakfast with tales of my previous night's adventures. Even my mom seemed interested, and looking back over the years, I realized she was torn between her love for country music, which involved my participation in it, and her strong Christian values that would not let her overlook the close ties to sinful living that always seemed to be a big part of the music business. I parsed my words as I told the family of my big adventures, playing guitar and singing by slightly embellishing the good parts and quickly skirting over anything that might arouse suspicion or tie me to any actions that I might have felt a little guilty about. This habit of selective memory would continue as long as I kept playing music, and I justified it like all musicians seem to do by just saying, "It's all part of the biz." Tom T. Hall kind of hinted at it in his song Homecoming with a line, "We don't call them beer joints, Dad. Nightclubs are the places where I work. You meet a lot of people there, but nah, there ain't no chance of getting hurt." Yeah, that's how I remember it too, Tom T. After breakfast, I told my 12-year-old brother, Chuck, about the secret stash under the front porch, and we decided we needed to let our best friends and partners in crime, the England boys, in on this wonderful bounty my musical talents had made available. Carl, Ralph, and Robert England were like extra brothers to us, and we did everything together. That afternoon, we gathered up the moonshine and RCs and headed to the England's house. We all went out into the woods, built a fire, and broke out the booze. We ranged from about 11 years old to 15, and only had that half a pint of moonshine, which I'm sure had been watered down for my own safety before it was ever given to me. Didn't matter, it had enough psychological kick to it that soon we were all telling wild tales, chasing wild girls, and cussing like sailors, and saying how much better it would be if we had Coca-Cola instead of RC Colas for chasers. I remember that as soon as the moonshine was gone, we almost instantly sobered up, And I'm sure our 5 little minds at that very moment started coming up with 5 different versions of the story we would tell about our party in the woods. Time has a way of letting reality sneak in, and I'm sure that other than a few neighborhood boys, nobody else ever heard our story, which was such a big adventure at the time. This story would have fallen into obscurity except for the fact that 45 years later, one of those boys would need a story for a book he was writing and decide to dust it off for one last telling. Hopefully, though not necessarily, a little closer to the truth than some of the previous versions.